CBS News is getting an exclusive look inside a Department of Homeland Security facility processing asylum seekers at the southern border. This is the first time news cameras have been allowed in such a facility during the Biden administration. This comes after the president announced plans to wind down the Remain in Mexico policy. The Trump-era rule kept tens of thousands of asylum seekers outside of the U.S. while their claims were being processed. Hundreds of families are still waiting in Mexico. CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez joins me now from McAllen, Texas. Hi there, Camilo. You got access to a DHS facility in Brownsville, Texas that is processing asylum seekers. Can you give us a sense, Camilo, of how things are looking there on the ground?
Sure. So for context, Elaine, during the Trump administration, more than 70,000 asylum seekers were sent back to Mexico and required to wait in dangerous Mexican border cities for their U.S. asylum court hearings. The Biden administration is now slowly letting some of these asylum seekers with pending cases into the U.S. And today we got an exclusive look into how this process works. The asylum seekers register for these appointments online. They are COVID tested in Mexico, and then they are processed by U.S. border officials. We witnessed the processing of about 20 asylum seekers today at the Brownsville port of entry, Elaine, including families with young children. They were screened for biometrics. Their bags were checked. But after a few minutes, they were allowed into the U.S. Well, they are now going to be staying while their asylum cases are adjudicated. So many of these families express relief at being here on American soil after months and even years, Elaine, of waiting in Mexico, because as you know, many of them face serious danger in these cities, including extortions, kidnappings, and even assaults.
So, Camilo, you answered my question about what happens to these migrants when they get to these facilities, but what are the chances that they will actually be granted asylum?
That's an excellent question, because these asylum seekers have not been granted asylum just yet. Their cases will continue to be adjudicated by U.S. courts, and judges will decide whether or not their cases merit asylum. But unlike the Trump administration, the Biden administration is now allowing them to continue that process here on American soil, and will allow them to have work permits so they can work while their cases are adjudicated. And we know that some of these families and some of these asylum seekers are already on planes to their respective destinations like Miami, New York, and other communities across the U.S.
Well, Camilo, you spoke with one family who was separated at the border under the Trump administration. The wife was pregnant at the time, and we want to play some of your conversation with her husband. Let's listen to that.
I imagine it was also difficult for you.
Sí, fue difícil para mí.
Yes, it was very difficult for me because it was a forced separation.
Una separación forzosa, no fue.
They didn't let us say goodbye. In the end, the last time we saw each other, she was behind glass in a cell. They sent me back to Mexico without any explanations.
Me sacaron, me retornaron a México.
Missing the birth of your child must have been the hardest thing as a father. Imagino que perder y no poder estar ahí con tu esposa en el nacimiento de tu hija fue algo lo más difícil durante tu estadía en México.
Sí, fue difícil porque.
Yes, it was difficult because I would have liked to be there, to be with my wife during her pregnancy, and then be there when my daughter came to this world.
Camilo, walk us through their story and what do they face now?
Sure. So Lázaro and Diana, two political dissidents from Cuba, came to the U.S.-Mexico border in 2019. Diana, who was pregnant at the time, was allowed into the U.S. under a grant of humanitarian parole, but Lázaro, the husband, was sent back to Mexico, Elaine, and told to wait there for the U.S. court hearing. So a family was essentially separated, and Lázaro had to wait more than a year in Mexico, missed the birth of their child, who was born here on American soil, and Diana tested positive for COVID during her pregnancy. She was diagnosed with postpartum depression. So the separation took a heavy emotional toll on the family. But under this new process that we covered today, Lázaro was allowed to enter the U.S. in March, and now the family is finally reunited here on American soil.
A beautiful baby there as we look at pictures of that, Camilo. Finally, President Biden nominated Sheriff Ed Gonzalez to serve as the Director of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. What can you tell us about him?
Sure. So Sheriff Gonzalez is the current sheriff in Harrison County, Texas. This is the most populous county in the state. And he has been charged, Elaine, with a pretty formidable and complicated task. ICE, as you know, oversees deportations and immigration arrests, as well as the largest immigration detention system in the world. It is an agency whose work, has become extremely polarized during the Trump administration in particular, because the Trump administration gave the agency broad discretion to deport and arrest most undocumented immigrants in the U.S., including those without criminal records. Mr. Biden has now tried to curtail arrests and to instruct agents to prioritize the arrest of those with criminal convictions, recent border crossers, as well as those who are a threat to public safety. But now Mr. Gonzalez, if confirmed by the Senate, will have to oversee these competing interests because, on one hand, progressives, some of whom have called for the abolishment of ICE, will want the agency to arrest less people, while conservatives will want the agency to arrest and deport more immigrants here in the U.S. And it's important to note, Elaine, that this is the second local law enforcement official that President Biden has nominated to lead an immigration enforcement agency. It was announced earlier this year that he had tapped Chris Magnus, the police chief in Tucson, Arizona, to lead Customs and Border Protection.
Yeah, really important context, Camilo. This is proving to be, as we've seen, such a complex and emotional issue, but amazing reporting there. Camilo Montoya-Galvez, just some powerful reporting from the U.S. southern border for us. Thank you.